Hey, my name is Bruce Snell, and I'm with BSG International, and we're going to be talking about our Applied Business Science Certificate program today. We're going to be focusing on Class 4, which is talking about breaking through the lack of training. And what we first want to do is look at probably on your page 1 in your handout, the product of lack of training. We find it's very important for us to understand what these barriers and what this stuff looks like internally within the organization to where you can address them. A usual scenario finds no budget for training. What we're talking about there, as we get into an organization, usually there's no budget set aside for training. So really training has become kind of an afterthought. So we're talking about some organizations take a hit and a miss approach to training. Again, what we're saying here is that the hit and a miss approach usually follows after we've had a problem. After we've had a problem in the organization, now we're going, hey, now we need to train, but it's already cost us way too much. So if you look at the hit and a miss training, we stop and start, we focus here, we focus there, and the training is not really going in any particular direction. Oftentimes, we look at training and see it as an expense or what we call a line item. So what happens is we take an attitude about training is that it's actually we're treating it as an expense and not as an asset. We need to really change our philosophy and stuff on training and what we're talking about and trying to get out of training. Remember, again, most of the training is reactive. Many organizations never really get started with the training program. It's very interesting, as I was going through and meeting a lot of CEOs and presidents, founders of organizations, most of the folks that have gone into business are either an engineering or an inventor or creative type that has created a product or service, and then they end up taking their product or service to market. The other side is usually like a salesman type that was working for another company and was doing everything, and they end up going, well, I might as well be in business for myself. And what was really interesting, every one of them that left their company go, you know, the other company we didn't train, we're going to train when we start our company. And what you find out, they get behind the wheel and then they never train. So what happens is, as the business starts growing and then there's no discipline for that training internally, the training never starts. So what happens, we end up being just like the other company. And oftentimes you fall into the flavor of the month training, whatever happens to be hot or whatever is talked about. And what we're saying there is that the flavor of the month is that we're constantly training or moving our direction in training from this subject or this, whether it's quality circles, TQM, whatever you want to call it, certification, ISO certification, another kind of internal certification. Well, the training's hitting all around and is not really going in any direction long term. This is what we're talking about, having to build a base training program for the entire organization to get everybody on the same page going into the same direction. Another interesting thing we talked about is the commitment from top management. A lot of times we're talking about the training. We're not necessarily talking about signing a thing or coming on the air and going, you know, hey, I support the training. All management, everybody in the organization has to be involved in training from the top down, because most of us are looking up to see what our boss is saying or doing. If our boss isn't supporting it, chances are that person reporting to them one level down is not going to support it. So it makes it unsafe for everybody. Remember fear? We talked about fear. So if you look at it, that's why the organization, everybody has to participate in training. And usually the easiest one to schedule is the CEO or the president. For the fact is that their days are literally almost full up totally, but what they're very good planners and schedulers. So if you look at that, starts setting the tone throughout the organization. So we have to have the commitment from the top. Another interesting thing that we discovered is says you have to budget 2 to 6% of payroll. Because as I got into some of these companies, they were going, okay, what do we budget for training? How much do we spend? What is it that we need? A good rule of thumb is that we need to budget 2 to 6% of payroll for training. And if you look at that, there's actually companies that spend 12%, 20%. Now remember, the larger the organization, the less you have to spend. So if you're a small organization, you need to be up probably at the top of that 6%. Because remember, if you're just starting out, this is when we're saying you need to build that infrastructure. So you need to set the schedule for your training a year in advance. And this is amazing because this is one of the first things your company will start struggling with, because we haven't done very well on a formal planning or scheduling internally within that organization. So if you look at it, first thing I start hearing is that they're going, hey, you're telling me to schedule a year in advance, and we talked about earlier about the what ifing the deal, what if a customer comes in, we're saying let's set the schedule a year in advance and set an hour every other week, and then that's going to start setting some disciplines internally within the organization. And your company will struggle with it because it's so unplanned right now, and especially the larger it is. Remember, we talked about becoming reactive to that organization. You have to have proactive training, and what we're talking about there with the proactive training is that the proactive training, we have to not wait for a problem or not wait until after there's a big issue in the company. We have to keep the training moving forward. It has to become proactive. So as we're dropping all these things into place, the results are we're getting a proactive training program. And we have to formalize the employee training with written procedure. Man, we have talked about this throughout there, is that if we're going to train our employees, what are we going to train them on? Well, we got to train them on written procedure, and guess what? When they start defining and working on procedure in their base work center, they're starting to learn process, step, and procedure. So there's a lot of reasons for everything that we're doing here. So it says you'll have leadership appear. Now this is interesting. As we go through this, we'll start getting people throughout the organization that will all of a sudden start taking the reins of the development of their base work centers and their team meetings. And it's a very small few because the majority aren't going to do anything. That's why we have to have the direction and the commitment of leadership, because the employees are all kind of dug in and waiting, and that's why it also has to be over a long period of time. So as the training starts developing and we're working internally and working on these 4 barriers, you start having leaders appear throughout the organization. And we have some phenomenal stories over these last 11 years of folks that have risen up through the organization in a leadership position. And it says change in sphere. Again, we're going to cover this at the end of the program, but if you look at change, I don't care if it's this big or this big, change is fear. So we have to always have that in the back of our mind. The majority of the stuff that our employees are responding to have nothing to do with you, have nothing to do with your organization, but it's just the way we react to change. And remember, we said change is fear. So we're going to dig in, we're going to shut down, and we're going to kind of hold back until we see what's going to happen with the organization, because we've been on that. And let's look at the training focus here. The understanding of the order request. So we're saying the training focus has to be on, we have to understand this order request. This will be taught later on in the series. But an order request, remember, is the order is from external and the request is internal. So literally all of us in our base work centers are really supporting or processing some part of that order request. And it says, we all provide a product and or service. That's what we're talking about. By supporting that order request, we're all of us here in the organization. I don't care if we're in the office or if we're managers, if we're truck drivers, if we're computer operators, if we're cameramen or whatever, we're all processing some part of that order request. That's why we're saying is that everybody in the organization is just as important as anyone else, because you can't have one base work center that kind of is out of the loop and the other ones aren't. That's why we have to train everybody in the organization. We also have to look at the data entry, collection, and reporting. How are we going to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor? We have to do it with data. We have to have those skills, again, those base skills throughout the organization of the 4 M's, basically the manpower, machine, material, and method. So what we're saying there, these are the things that we got to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. These are what the base skills are about, getting these skills, these transferable skills, all the way down through the organization. So we have to, the training focus again is managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring of our base work centers. The goal, all employees self-manage. And what we're talking about there with self-managed is that the fact that we're not having to run off and we've got an okay to do our job. So what we're saying here is not necessarily running off and having to ask to get an approval to do things. If we define those jobs well enough and we're working on the 4 barriers, we have to give that responsibility to those base work centers. So again, what we're saying here is that we somewhat become self-managed. We want all the base work centers managing themselves, one level up reporting, and then that manager is managing that collection of base work centers, that data. That's how they manage. That's the systems that we have to manage internally within the organization. Right now, I'd like for you to turn to page 4. Page 4 is a story called Universities of Tomorrow. And it was really kind of interesting how we got started with this. We kind of wrote this story a long time ago. And it talks about the majority of the time, it says, after going into many of the companies, I discovered a lot of our employees didn't have what we called base skills. Somehow or another, we lacked interpersonal skills, process skills, literally systems, just basic business skills as well as interpersonal skills. So what happened was we started building internally within the organizations that we first started in these things to help our employees, both people and process. And in that's where the base skills came in from. At any given time, you have 3 to 10% of the general population unemployed. So what we're saying there is the chances are that we're going to have literally 97% of the employees in general in the workplace. So what we're saying is, where's the best place to educate our employees? It's going to be at that university on site, what we call an awareness center. Because what happens, whether we like it or not, we're going to have to train our employees. Every dollar we spend on our employee training not only help our people, but it also helps the organization long term. If you're in business short term or churning or burning numbers, this program's probably not for you because it's too long term. We're looking at building the infrastructure internally within the organization. And we're saying that charity begins at home. Now, we've all kind of heard that thing before, is that charity begins at home. And we're saying if we're going to be giving to outside organizations or charities or whatever, let's give to our own people. Let's look internally within the organization and look at our people and say, what are the things that we can do to help our people? Best thing to do is looking at benefiting them both in people and process skills, interpersonal skills that they will be able to learn, not only communicate at work better, but be able to take those skills home and in turn help their families that will in turn help their communities. So let's give to our own people. Let's do that. The universities of tomorrow will be our businesses and corporations. It's our responsibility to train our employees. If you look at it, again, what we're saying, so many people are working 50 hours a week, and we're saying, go out and get this education, go out and do this. When are they going to do it? They also, the majority of us have families. So we've got to do that internally within the organization and schedule this internally within the organization within the 1 to 8 hours. And what we're saying there is that if you schedule it a year in advance, you will not miss that 1 or 2 hours a month of training. Believe me, I guarantee you're not going to miss it. And in fact, that's going to make you become better organized. Okay, let's look at, it says our organizations will become the university tomorrow with the employees being the students. The base skills must include both people and process. And see, and this is what we're talking about. These skills, we have a tendency to teach these skills that would show us how to plug in a software to run a computer program or whatever. And we're saying all this skill and base skill training really has to be both people and process, because we cannot train one without the other because one affects the other. So we have to look at kind of changing our thought and our process on this, on how in the world that we're doing business and training our people. And let's turn now to page number 5. Like I said, we have a ton of stuff that we've got to cover today to kind of wrap up this awareness of the 4 barriers to quality. If you look at it, we want to talk about barrier 4, breaking through the lack of training, the product of lack of training. What we're asking you to do is to step back and let's see what this lack of training looks like internally within the organization. Okay, the lack of training. The first one is that no commitment from the president or CEO. And this again is what we were talking about the other day. We're saying no commitment from the CEO or president. That does not mean me signing something and passing it around or emailing it to everybody and go, hey, I support the training program. The guy at the top has to be involved in the training. And believe me, every employee in your organization is watching to see if their boss is participating. They're watching to see if their coworkers are participating. You remember we talked about the 1% that affect the 5% that affect the 20%? Everybody's watching to see if they're going to be participating, because interesting, what we've seen is that those guys have been able to manipulate and not participate. But they're the first ones to run up front and tell everybody what's going on and what's wrong. Total manipulation. Let's look at no budget for training. As we get through an organization and we're talking about the product of lack of training, there's usually no budget at all for training. In fact, we had talked about that we kind of train after a tragedy. So we're saying in most organizations, an informal training program, there's no budget. Yes, you have a trainer. Yes, you have an HR person. That poor HR person anymore, they're doing everything but HR. They're doing everything but involvement with their people. They're now keeping certification, classification, every other thing out there. So that job has changed over the last 10 years. We've almost taken the human out of human resource. Okay, let's look at don't know what to train on. Now that's another interesting thing. We've gone into companies that all of a sudden have budgeted, or there's some state funding available or federal funding available for training. And they go, okay, we got money, now what do we train on? And that was interesting. Everybody goes, okay, let's do some software training. Let's do some forklift. Let's do some safety training. We're saying, what are we trying to train on? What we're trying to train on is how to do our job. So if you look at it here, it says, not only do we not have a budget, but we don't know what to train on. We need to train on our jobs. That's where the base work center stuff came in. Where do we start? That's another interesting question. We got up here, okay, how do you start? Let's just say your organization was going to start today on training. How do you get it started? Where do you go? What do you do? How do you get this massive thing across the organization? If you look at, most of us don't know where to start. That's why the training becomes kind of a hit and a miss. This is what we're saying. It has to be a base training for the entire organization, mapped out, planned out, and let the training director, let the quality director, let the human resource director or vice president, let them manage, plan, schedule, and monitor it. You will have people throughout the organization that can help you with it. No formal training program, and that's what we were talking about. The no formal training program is that literally it's a kind of, again, in that hit and a miss training program. We're trying to train, trying to help our people, trying to do things, but it's not formal. And what you'll see is that, okay, let's set training 2 weeks down the road. Guess what? We get to 2 weeks down the road, half the people are gone, half ain't there, and all of a sudden we got 2 people sitting in training going, man, I'm now starting to, everybody's saying they're too busy to be here. What kind of precedence, what kind of tone does that set? We're already setting up in a negative manner about that training program. We're saying the hit and the miss training. The hit and the miss training is, again, what we had covered earlier, is that the hit and the miss training is that we kind of take something that's out there, we throw it at our workplace, we work on it, go through it, and now we're going to step back and say, okay, what do we train on next? Or we're reacting after a tragedy, so now we're going to train. Training is viewed as an expense and not as an asset attitude problem. Ooh, I tell you what, over the last 20 years, if we've done nothing else in school, we sure have taught everybody the numbers. I tell you what, when I first got started years ago, most of the businesses, and especially entrepreneurs, didn't really understand what we were talking about, or their numbers, or their balance sheets and stuff. So it's like we've almost overcorrected here, that we're looking at and treating everything as a debit or a credit. And we have a tendency to look at the training, and it's kind of been programmed through training that the training is an expense. And so what happens, it takes that attitude, so now all of a sudden we got a line item management issue coming up, we just strike training. We have to make training and education a part of our budget and a part of our payroll and a part of our balance sheet. So in what was really sad, I was speaking down in Florida, And these guys come out and they're young kids, only about 26 or something, right out of school, and they're going, what's the bottom line? What's the bottom line? I go, you know, that's really sad. They totally missed the subject. They totally missed the message, went right over their head. How do you put a bottom line number on a happy employee? How do you put a bottom line number on a satisfied customer? You can't go to your balance sheet. Long term, it'll show up. But this is what we really need to be conscious of, this line item management stuff. And we have all probably have heard of Dr. Deming. If you think I'm talking some junk here, go read his stuff and he'll tell you. And we can't even start to dispute what he has said and what he's done over these 50 years. Training never gets started. Remember what we talked about with the other companies, and we actually have a story in the book talking about we're going to get started training. We're not going to be like the other company. We go and we never get started in training. So in effect, we become just like that other organization, the one that we left that didn't train, that we said when we get into another company, we're either going to train or start. We never do. Flavor of the month training. We're talking about right there, the flavor of the month training is that whatever happens to be hot or the ticket that's on the market, whatever new book has come out, we're going to all of a sudden start training on this thing. And really, what do we need to train on? We got to train our people on people skills and processes. That's never going to change. I'll say it right here. That is never going to change. We have to focus on our people. The easy stuff is the process stuff, because that's tangible. The tough stuff is the people issues and those 4 barriers and all that stuff that we're attacking and that we face daily internally within the organization. We're saying training starts after a problem. You're going to hear that 100 times. Think about it. When is the last time? And I usually find this in safety. We go into a company and all of a sudden they have an accident and somebody runs over somebody with a forklift or drops about $10,000 worth of product, and they're going, hey, well, why'd you do that? Well, didn't know, I hit the wrong lever. Okay, we're saying here, usually training starts after a tragedy. So what we're looking at is being, what we had talked about earlier, being proactive in training. Here's another interesting one here. It is called Certify for the Sake of Certifying. And that story's in the book. And what we talk about there, certifying for the sake of certifying, is that I have got to get some type certification, not only to pin on my wall, to pin on my stuff, or put on the window, or put on the building outside that says I'm certified. What you will see, business and 99% of those things never change. We don't get the people involved. We rush through to get it certified. We're doing everything but doing what that intent of that program was, which was to do training. We turn it and look at it. We got to get certified. Okay, what can you certify us for? They try to cut the price, and then what they try to do is that, let's get certified in a month. And what you'll see is that everybody will jump on that bandwagon because, again, that's a tangible product, is that certification. So if you look at this, we're talking about the certifying for the sake of certifying. A lot of the good training, there's a ton of good training stuff that's out there, but we go into it with the wrong attitude. Once we're certified, we leave it and we move on. Then another interesting thing, if we do a quarterly, monthly, or annually audit, everybody's jumping through hoops 2 weeks before the certification person comes through there, and make sure that we get recertified with the audits. And then what happens? We go back to business as usual. And what I found, these mapping of these processes of these certifications don't even look like how in the world we're doing the deal on the floor. And what's interesting, because of the fear, the people are going to tell you yep, that's exactly what we have. We've even had it to where the process ain't even called the same thing and we're signing off on it. Another thing we're talking about, our business is different. That's another interesting thing we talk about. Our business is different. I'm not like your other companies. I'm not like companies here. Our business is growing too fast to train. I want you to listen to that statement. Our business is growing too fast to train. Our business is growing too fast in order to build the infrastructure. Our business is growing too fast because it's changing daily. Man, how in the world are you changing? How are you going to grow and sustain it? How are you going to have that continuance and growth? If you're growing that fast and you're not formalizing how in the world, that even further defines why you need training. So if you look at where we're growing, I'll tell you, if you're growing too fast and you ain't got to do training, I guarantee you your annual growth, and there's some boys that are coming out now with some things, we got to grow that business 20 to 30% because we don't really know where the numbers are at. And if you look at that 20 to 30% growth, it's hard to finance that, and it's hard to get a true picture of where the organization is at. But believe me, what'll happen is that that thing drops below 10% annual growth, or it flattens out. All the rocks are going to start showing. So if we're growing at a 10 to 30% annual, believe me, we're throwing money and body at the issues. We're not even addressing the real issues. We can't get the product out the door. Oh, hire another person to put the product out the door. We're getting more software problems, more issues. We need to hire another customer service. Okay. We need to be asking why are our customer service calls adding up. Can't manage or monitor. What we're saying here is that the majority of the programs, again, are informal. There's no structure. They're not going in any particular direction. They're so vague we don't understand it, meaning the fact is that we have 5 people going to the same training. We come out with 10 different interpretations of what we thought that training because it's so poorly documented. We can't even monitor it. We can't manage it. We can't plan it. We can't schedule it. An overloaded HR person, bless their hearts. Those guys are working night and day and they're never getting on top of it. What we're saying here is that the HR departments, the training departments, quality directors, all these folks need to get into managing their training programs, but really they have not had a training program organization-wide to manage. So what we're saying here is that put them back in and give them a management system and let them manage the organization, let them manage the planning, scheduling. Okay, so that's what we're talking about, the product of lack of training. If you look at this, we're wanting to say, how do we address the lack of training? Now, it's really interesting. We talked about a bunch of stuff here, is that the first thing is that we've got to budget 2 to 6% of payroll for training. And somebody I know is out there right now pulling their hair out. How in the world are we going to budget 2 to 6% of payroll? Man, let me tell you, just get started training. Just get started of getting that budget going of that 2 to 6% of payroll. Because if you don't budget, remember, we're saying you're not going to start, or you're going to have a lump sum that's sitting out there, and then all of a sudden it's going to be at the end of the year, we hadn't spent it because I'm too busy doing other things to plan it. So all of a sudden we're trying to dump out our training budget to get it budgeted out there, get our people involved daily, weekly, monthly in training throughout the thing. We have to remove the fear. And a lot of this removing the fear with the training or the participating in training starts at the top. That's what we were saying. If the man that's signing our check or that we're reporting to participating in training, it literally leaves me no room not to commit or not to be involved in training. Because remember, we spend most of our time looking up instead of looking down on how to support our people here. So we have to look at removing the fear. You're seeing why now the 4 barriers are all connected. Open and honest communication. As we're working through the training and we're working on the communication, we have to start opening up our communication. And by talking about with a common language and vision, that in itself starts opening up the communication. So as we're working on barrier 1 and 2, this starts helping us develop this written procedure. We have to have the written procedures because if you look at again, how do we do it? What are we going to train on? We have to have written procedure. We have to break the organization down by systems. We have to break those systems down by processes. We have to break those processes down by base work centers. So if you look at it by teaching us the skills, those base skills, we're able now to define our process steps and procedures with the written procedure. Again, the commitment from the top. The guy signing our check has to be involved in it. We have to budget dollars, times for training. So when we're looking at it, not just say we're going to do training, but set out a schedule and budget the time and budget the dollars for that training. And don't get so hung up on, you've got somebody there with a sharp pencil looking at, well, if you take 2 people out and you times that times their dollar and you times that, and then all of a sudden we're getting all sick on what training's costing us. They're saying that anywhere from 30% of the day is wasted. I thought that was a bunch of bull until I actually got into some of these organizations and looked at how many times we're doing things over, how many times we're keep processing or doing the same thing twice, or the fact that I'm doing it, somebody else is doing it, then we're all having to redo it. So if you look at it, don't look at those hours, because what you're going to see is that if you plan, schedule, and monitor and have the commitment from the top, you're not going to miss the hours, you're not going to miss the work, but somebody's going to be the first one to run and tell you, what do you want me to do, my job or training? We're going to say, we want you to do both. It's a part of your job, it's not an option. Because remember that 1 to 15 to 20% are ready to jump on this deal because they see the accountability coming down the pike and they don't want it. So the other guys in the organization or don't trust them, they're just waiting to see when the other shoe's going to drop. So there's a lot of things that we have to do internally. Addressing the what ifs, this is very important, because what if this happens? What if a customer comes in? What if production shuts down? What if it rains in Spain? We're saying that set the schedule, set the budget, and get started. We'll address those issues there. And remember, we're talking about the 1%. As masters at manipulating and throwing that what-ifing deal to the table. So if you look at it, we can address the what-ifs and say, guys, if we come into it, that's why the guy at the top has to make the decision, because it's not an easy decision to train, not an easy decision to go into a new product line. It's not an easy decision to make an acquisition. It's really interesting in a lot of companies I've seen is that guy at the top's very dogmatic and has made all the decisions, but what happens when it gets down to some tough decisions, we become very democratic. Now we throw it out there to the organization. Well, what do you think? I'll tell you what they think. They don't want to do it because of fear. They don't want to do it because they're already overworked and overstressed. That's where it takes the guy at the top to step up and say, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. So that's if I've ever doubted that we have to have the leadership at the top, somebody has to make that decision. Don't put it out there and try to get everybody's approval, because you're not going to do it. You're going to get everybody kind of wounded with their other ways of doing business, whether the way we've done it in the company before or whether the way it was done at another organization. We're saying training leadership, 18%. Well, we're saying internally within the organization, we have to train a minimum of 18%, because with the people leaving the organization annually and the growth of the organization and new and changing employees and expanding of jobs, product line, and service, is that if we have to train 18% of the workforce, including all management, is that it stays in the organization. That seemed to be a good number that we were able to work out for retention and to keep that thing going. If you look at leadership must take the lead, what we're saying here is that the leadership of the organization has to take the lead. They have to set the tone. Our people in the organization is absolutely powerless to define system, process, or procedure, or to start a training program, or to improve anything. Management has to take the lead. We have to give management, the leadership, the tools to do that. Team profile. It's interesting, all employees are involved. Like I said, when I first got into this stuff years ago, they were saying quality was an option. You can participate or volunteer, and I'm going, man, what is that saying? That's going like, hey, you can be quality if you want to. We're saying quality is not an option. Everybody in the organization has to participate. Let's not leave any gray area there. Everybody has to participate in the organization. This is where the 1 to 5 to 20% are really going to start squirming. Quality coordinator. It's really interesting. We feel that the quality coordinator, we need to take a new look at that job internally within an organization. A quality coordinator, quality is throughout the organization. And we're saying that the quality coordinator should be able to go from one department to the next and should have an overview and a direction and a say on quality throughout the organization, whether in what department or not. Whether that quality director is reporting to the human resource or we have a separate quality director. But what happens, we got to have somebody that can cross those departmental lines. That used to be the human resource person. A lot of organizations that doesn't exist anymore. We call it just-in-time training, and I kind of hate to use that because that word's been overused a gazillion times, and you wouldn't believe what they're teaching us in school about that just-in-time stuff. If you look at just-in-time training, what we're saying here is that when we train that we take the training and we retrain it within 1 to 3 weeks. And what we're saying is that we do that over 2 years. And the reason for that, we give 1 hour of training, you have 1 to 3 weeks to retrain that. Then we train you again, then you retrain that. Now what happens there is that is for retention purposes. Because how many times have we been sent off site, gone to this big training thing, and a week later we're back and we're trying to figure out, number one, what is it what we were supposed to do? Because most of that mess is so poorly defined, it's our interpretation of what was wanted or how we're going to carry it out. So if you look at that, we're saying just-in-time training for retention purpose of both the training leadership, of management, and of the organization. Team training, 1 hour every other week. Let's budget it in there. That we have team training, base work center training, employee training, 1 hour every other week. And I've actually been in, they go, well, Bruce, that's basically, why don't we just do all 24 hours to get the year out of the way? It ain't going to work because of the 4 barriers. Every time we meet, we knock a notch down in that fear. The communication goes up, the training goes up, the written procedure goes up, the communication starts up. And so if you look at what we're talking about, there's a rhyme and a reason for a minimum 2-year commitment training to your training program. Learn through doing. LTD, what we say here is that we can sit here and write this stuff all day long until we get out there and actually apply it, do we learn it? So yes, we have good documentation on how to do it, but really the only way most of us learn is really by getting in there and making it happen. And that is, I've told you before, it's like us when we get a bicycle for Christmas. What do? First thing we do is throw the box away, throw the instructions, and start putting it together. We learn through doing. Same with the software. How many of you folks have looked at your software package manual? What do? We get in and start hitting it until we figure it out. Cameramen, how do you learn it? What we do is that we just hop up to the camera and start twisting and turning on things. We very seldom read the manuals. Now, we might have some engineers that read it, but the majority of us don't. We actually want to jump in there, we feel comfortable, hands-on, and learn how to do it. And it's hard to equate that written stuff down there. So what we're looking at is kind of getting that stuff into a parameter here to keep our employees going in the same direction there. So we're talking now about how do we address it. Let's look at, see the results of this stuff. If you look at, we say proactive training. Proactive training, remember, is that we're not training after a tragedy. The training is proactive. It's going in one direction. And then if we have issues pop up, we have the base skills built internally at all levels throughout the organization to correct it. You know where it's going, and what it's going to cost up front. It's very important to know where you're going with the training program. It's very important to know what it's going to cost. So when you start formalizing your organization, start formalizing your training program, you not only know where it's going to go, when is it going to start, but how much it's going to cost. And don't let those guys beat you to death with that hourly cost of your employee. Believe me, if you schedule a year in advance, you ain't going to miss those 2 hours. Yes, I know you're frustrated and you're already working 50 hours a week, but this will help long-term get rid of all those issues that we're sitting there redoing because we didn't have the training and the processes and the procedures defined. Organization-wide based training, that's another thing we're talking about. Training has to be organization-wide, and when we're formalizing, we have an organizational training program, talking the same language, same page, and so that's what we call an organization-wide. Everybody receiving the same curriculum, the same classes, going in the same direction. Becomes common knowledge internally within the organization. Then the results of this, we also had the training of new hires and cross-training of employees. That's what I was telling you, what was funny the other day. We talked here, the thing, let's cross-train. Well, we're saying we can't even train with what we got. How in the world are we going to cross-train? We send somebody over there to kind of hang out for a couple of weeks. A formal training program, we're able to train new hires, and we're also able to cross-train those employees. That's also going to set up our requirements for employment. By defining those base work centers, that's going to tell us what skills that they need in order for us to hire those folks. New leadership appearance, and what we're talking there, that's really one of the biggest values of this thing. You'll start seeing people that will get very excited, and it's going to be less than 10% of your workforce that's going to step up and get involved and promote and see this leadership coming out through the organization. And even if they're not in the front runner as a team manager or team leader or facilitator, they will start developing and be those leaders working on their base work center and improving those processes and steps. Internal trainers by base work center. This is what we're talking about, how tough it is that as we're developing these base work centers, developing these base skills, learning to write process, step, and procedure, we now have developed internal trainers. Who is the best person to tell you how to do the job? The guy doing the job. So he's documented. Chances are that's the best person to tell us how to train it. So in effect, you start having internal trainers internally within your organization. So if you look at that, where you had one person that's trying to train everybody known to civilized man internally within your organization, we're moving it down on and to that base work center. Look at the job specific, budgeted, and scheduled. We're saying training will become specific to that base work center or that job. Not only here, as we get out of school, as we get out of a training class, we all go back, how do we apply it? Or that training was good, but it doesn't apply to my job. This training will be job specific by your base work center process, steps, and procedure. And it's going to be people and process training. You can't do one without the other. We have to train our people. We have to train them on how to define the processes. We have to define and help them with their interpersonal skills. A formalized training program. Well, that's what we're talking about, formalizing how in the world we're doing business by formalizing our training program. The training becomes focused, directed, managed, planned, scheduled, and monitored. Okay, when you plan it out, you have a tangible training program. Now you can manage, plan, schedule, and monitor it. Now what you're going to be able to do is collect data, because that 1 to 5 to 20% are going to start showing up. Because they're going to tell you that they ain't got to be at training, or they always have an excuse, or they always taking a phone call, they always got a big client. That starts setting double standards, and that starts aggravating everybody in the organization, because they see that's business as usual. The same people are going to try to manipulate this. We're going to remove the emotional deal, and we're going to be able to focus in on procedure. We're going to be able to focus in on hardcore data, because that's the only black and white area that we can get a lot of these guys and shake them up and wake them up, and that is with absenteeism and tardiness. Ongoing and continuous training. We won't miss training hours. Guys, we're not going to miss it. If you schedule it for, yeah, you're going to have, I've had production that's punching out widgets by the second. They were able to do it. But what you're going to see is you're going to hear every reason why you can't. Well, we've got to say that's why the guy at the top's got to say it. That's why the guy at the top's got to do it. And saying, well, whatever happens, let's at least get started. And again, that's why a lot of it never does get started. 2 to 4 hours per month of training. We have to schedule that in order to have for continuance and growth and a formalized training program. We also need to have team building and meeting skills. By meeting in these teams and by having these team members understanding rules and regulations on how we interact with one another, we're building team skills and meeting skills, because most of us, our last time we've been in a formal meeting has been in school or in high school. And most of us get married, get out, go to work, we get in the workplace, and a lot of times our growth stops. And we're saying we have to have these skills developed for, again, this continuance and growth of an organization. So not only that, problem-solving skills, we're saying that we got to learn to not only identify, that's what's so important with the base work centers and with the 4 barriers to quality awareness, to where we can identify these problems and potential problems. So in that, we have to have problem-solving skills. So, and we'll talk about those later on in the program. And that's also in your book under the 4 problem-solving skills. Task team for continuous improvement. Once we've learned these team skills, once we learn these process skills, once we've learned these brainstorming skills, we also now take those skills and apply them to what we call task team or task team building. A task team is a formalized structure in order for us to take issues, whether they're in my department or another, whether we're introducing a new product or a new service, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. But now we're able here to put the task teams for continuous improvement. Reason we're doing that because most of the time our product's changing, our service is changing, our paperwork's changing, our organization is changing. We're now looking at how do we remember we keep talking about that continuance and growth. That's what's so important here. Okay, so we've now covered, if you look at it, the number one, what does training look like? The lack of training. How do we address it? And the results of a formalized training program. And now if you look at on page number 6, it says existing training. As again, this story is talking about don't know what to train on. They didn't know what they need, and we talked about that. The other interesting thing, it's not necessarily they know where to start on their training. And we're saying here that you have to budget 2 to 6% of payroll for training. Training without direction, well, we can cause the company to continually stop and start. That's what we're talking about, and that's what's disheartening to the organization and to its employees. We have to have a 24-month program that can be managed, planned, scheduled, and monitored. We know in order to improve the business, we first have to define it. And if you look at it, I'd kind of like to look at that life lesson. That life lesson is the best people to help you design what is needed for your training internally within your organization are your employees and that person doing that particular task. That's exactly what we're talking about. So let's kind of go over again what we were talking about this existing training, this particular story here. Number one is that we don't know where to start. We know where to start. We got to start defining the organization system. How are you going to grow the organization or get a hold of where we're at in the organization without defining the organization? By defining the organization, you're defining the systems. By defining the systems, you're defining the processes. By defining the processes, you're defining the base work centers. And by defining those base work centers, you're learning process, step, and procedure-based skills. As we're learning these skills here, we're now able to attack issues outside of our base work center. But if we're looking at like that strategic plan I told y'all, that was real interesting, that we go into strategic planning, and then all of a sudden we're a year later in another strategic plan, trying to strategic plan for the stuff that we didn't accomplish after the first strategic plan. The reason it's never accomplished, there's no system or process in place internally within the organization. And management can't do it alone. There's absolutely no way that's why we had to build the base skills throughout the whole organization. So instead of it just being 18 to 20 or 12%, meaning the leadership of the organization, we get the whole organization. And I'm going, if you're going to strategic plan, what's the best thing to start with? I guarantee you the best thing to strategic plan is define your organization. Because how in the world, I don't care what your strategic planning, where are we going, how are we going to get there, what's our new product, what's our new market, what's it going to look like in 5 years, I guarantee you, you're not going to be able to accomplish any of those things long term, not unless we define our organization. This is a great way to get the organization going in one direction in this strategic planning. Yeah, we can start building this organizational structure, but if we built those task team skills, problem-solving skills, worked on fear, worked on communication, written procedure, and training, we can have separate task teams going out here addressing these current issues or projected issues of like, what market are we going to go into? What's that product or service going to cost? Who's our new customers? How are we going to support what we're selling? How are we going to document what we're doing? Who is going to be our new suppliers? Do we need to outsource, insource? What are all these things we need to do? Well, we will have the skills internally with everyone that's involved in there to be involved in the solution. So if you're looking at it, by getting these base skills, we got everybody in the organization involved. We got everybody having the skills to help out the organization and help out one another. Now, we're going to take a little bit of a break here. And again, I'd like for everybody to think about what we talked about, what the lack of training looks like. Also, too, there's strict bullet points that we've talked about that we'll keep reinforcing continually from here on out, and in the past we did. We're going to come back with the flavor of the month story. So I'd like for y'all to think about what we've talked about, and we'll see you here after the break.